The winter afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of New Horizons Youth Shelter in Washington, D.C., where dozens of teenagers from diverse backgrounds had found temporary refuge from challenging circumstances. Inside the modest community room, staff members made final preparations for what the shelter director had described only as special guests, coming to discuss education and career opportunities. When the front doors opened, revealing Stephen Miller, the former senior advisor to President Trump known for his conservative immigration policies, and Representative AndJasmin Crocket, the progressive Democrat from Texas known for her advocacy on social justice issues, the staff exchanged glances of surprise. These two political figures, often positioned at opposite ends of the spectrum, were not a pairing anyone had anticipated. As they entered together, neither wearing the formal attire typical of their Washington appearances, the teenagers looked up with expressions ranging from curiosity to uncertainty. Many recognized these public figures who typically appeared in contentious political contexts, making their joint arrival all the more unexpected. "Thank you all for welcoming us today," Crocket began, her voice carrying warmth that immediately softened the room's tension. "Mr. Miller and I have come not to discuss politics, but to listen and learn about your experiences and aspirations." Miller nodded in agreement. "We have very different perspectives on many policy issues," he acknowledged candidly. "But we share genuine interest in understanding the challenges you face and how young Americans from all backgrounds can find pathways to opportunity." The authenticity in their voices captured everyone's attention. What brought these political opposites together to this youth shelter, and what would unfold over the next 2 hours, would demonstrate something increasingly rare in American public life: the capacity to set aside political positioning to engage directly with young people facing real-world challenges. If you appreciate moments that bridge division to focus on helping young people, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. To understand the significance of this unexpected visit, we need to recognize how it came about despite the profound political differences between these two public figures. Stephen Miller had built his career advocating for conservative approaches to immigration, national sovereignty, and traditional values. As a senior advisor in the Trump administration, he had helped shape policies aimed at strengthening border enforcement and reforming immigration systems through restrictive measures. His political perspective emphasized national security, cultural cohesion, and economic policies focused on domestic priorities. Miller approaches policy through a framework that prioritizes national sovereignty and cultural continuity, noted one former colleague. He believes strongly in creating systems that maintain clear boundaries while providing orderly pathways for those who follow established processes. After leaving the White House, Miller had established America First Legal, an organization focused on advancing conservative legal principles. Though maintaining his distinct political perspective, he had recently expressed interest in finding practical solutions for vulnerable young Americans regardless of background, particularly those aging out of foster care or facing homelessness during their transition to adulthood. Representative AndJasmin Crocket had traveled a very different path to public service. After establishing herself as a civil rights attorney in Texas, she had won her congressional seat in 2022, quickly becoming known for her progressive advocacy on voting rights, criminal justice reform, and expanded social supports. Her political framework emphasized addressing systemic barriers and expanding access to opportunity, particularly for historically marginalized communities. Representative Crocket approaches policy through a lens of expanding access and addressing structural inequities, her chief of staff explained. She believes strongly in creating systems that provide support and opportunity to those facing the greatest barriers, particularly young people at risk of being left behind. These different frameworks had placed Miller and Crocket on opposite sides of numerous policy debates throughout their careers. From immigration to social programs, from regulatory approaches to government's proper role, they represented genuinely alternative visions for governance that democracy requires for meaningful choice. What few people knew until now was how their paths had unexpectedly crossed 6 weeks earlier during a congressional hearing on youth homelessness. as witnesses shared heartbreaking statistics about teenagers aging out of foster care without adequate support. Both Miller and Crocket had been visibly moved by testimony from young people who had experienced these challenges firsthand. After the hearing, they had found themselves waiting for the same elevator, where instead of the awkward silence political opponents might typically maintain, they began a surprising conversation about the testimony they had just heard. "Despite our many differences, I was struck by how that young man's story affected you," Crocket had commented, noting Miller's attentive expression during particularly difficult testimony. "His challenges transcend our political divisions," Miller had acknowledged. "Young people facing homelessness need practical support regardless of political frameworks." This brief exchange had led to coffee in the congressional cafeteria, where they discovered unexpected alignment around certain practical concerns despite maintaining their distinct political perspectives. Both recognized the particular vulnerability of teenagers navigating the transition to adulthood without family support. Both understood the importance of education and skill development for creating sustainable pathways to independence. And both acknowledged that ideological positioning often obscured practical solutions that could help young people in immediate need. "What struck me about our conversation," Crocket later reflected, "wasn't policy agreement, where our differences remained substantial. It was recognition that beneath those differences lies shared concern for young people facing extraordinary challenges, concern that transcends typical political positioning." Miller had nodded. "We approach these issues through different frameworks, but we both recognize that young Americans facing homelessness need practical pathways to stability and opportunity. That recognition creates space for finding certain common ground without requiring either of us to abandon our distinct perspectives." This unexpected connection had led to a series of conversations about how young people at the margins might be better served through approaches that transcended typical partisan frameworks. Those conversations, conducted away from cameras and political performance, had revealed genuine interest in understanding the lived experiences of teenagers facing homelessness, understanding that might inform more effective approaches regardless of political perspective. Their visit to New Horizons Youth Shelter had emerged from these conversations, not as political event, but as genuine effort to listen and learn from young people navigating extraordinary challenges. Both had agreed to come without staff or media, creating space for authentic engagement beyond political positioning. What experiences have helped you set aside differences to focus on helping others? Share your stories in the comments below. As Miller and Crocket settled into the community room, the initial awkwardness began dissolving into something more genuine. Rather than delivering prepared remarks or political messaging, they started by asking questions, creating space for the teenagers to share their experiences directly. "Before we talk, we'd like to listen," Miller explained simply. "Would anyone be willing to share what brought you here, and what challenges you've faced finding stability?" This straightforward invitation opened space for authentic dialogue that quickly transcended the political context in which these public figures typically operated. A 17-year-old named Marcus was the first to speak, describing his journey through multiple foster placements before aging out of the system without family support or stable housing. "The hardest part isn't even being homeless," he explained with remarkable poise. "It's trying to stay in school and plan for the future when you don't know where you'll sleep next week. How do you focus on education when your basic needs aren't secure?" Both Miller and Crocket listened attentively, asking thoughtful follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than political calculation. Their questions focused on understanding practical challenges rather than filtering experiences through ideological frameworks, creating space for the teenagers to speak authentically about their lives. As more young people shared their stories, certain themes emerged that transcended typical political divides. Many described bureaucratic barriers that complicated accessing existing services, challenges that resonated with both Miller's concern about government inefficiency and Crockett's focus on systemic obstacles. Others highlighted the importance of job skills and educational opportunities, connecting with Miller's emphasis on self-sufficiency while reflecting Crockett's focus on expanded access. "What would have made the biggest difference when you first needed help?" Crocket asked, directing her question to a young woman named Sophia, who had been quietly listening. "Having one person who could help me navigate all the different systems," Sophia responded after thoughtful consideration. "There are programs for housing, different ones for education, others for healthcare, but figuring out how they all connect while you're in crisis is almost impossible." Miller nodded, taking notes. "That fragmentation creates barriers even when resources technically exist. You're describing a coordination problem that transcends typical budget debates." This recognition, that practical implementation often matters as much as policy design, created space for dialogue that moved beyond traditional political positioning. Throughout the conversation, both visitors maintained their distinct perspectives while finding unexpected alignment around certain practical concerns that affected these young people's immediate well-being. The most powerful moment came when 16-year-old Darnell described falling behind in school after becoming homeless following his mother's hospitalization for mental health issues. "I was a good student before everything fell apart," he explained, emotion evident beneath his measured words. "But trying to do homework in a shelter, or study for tests when you haven't slept properly, it feels impossible. The system expects you to perform like everyone else when your circumstances are completely different." Something in Darnell's story visibly resonated with both visitors. Miller shared how a teacher had created flexible arrangements that helped a family member complete high school during a period of housing instability. Crocket described similar experiences from her legal work with youth in the juvenile system who faced educational disruption. "Education creates crucial pathways to stability," Miller observed. "When young people lack secure housing, maintaining educational progress becomes extraordinarily difficult despite their potential and effort." Crocket nodded. "And the implications extend far beyond individual students. Our entire society loses valuable contributions when talented young people face barriers that prevent them from developing their capabilities." This shared recognition, that supporting vulnerable youth served both individual and societal interests, created space for dialogue that transcended typical political framings. Without abandoning their distinct perspectives, both visitors found unexpected alignment around certain practical concerns that affected these teenagers' immediate well-being and future possibilities. As the conversation continued, shelter staff noticed something remarkable happening. The teenagers, initially cautious about engaging with political figures, became increasingly comfortable sharing their experiences and aspirations. Rather than encountering the dismissal or judgment they often feared, they found genuine interest and respect from visitors approaching their circumstances through different but equally attentive perspectives. "What would help you most right now as you think about your future?" Miller asked, directing his question to the entire group. The responses revealed immediate practical needs that transcended political frameworks. Stable housing that didn't require moving every few weeks, educational support that accommodated their challenging circumstances, job training that created pathways to economic independence, and perhaps most poignantly, connections with adults who believed in their potential despite their current situations. "We have different approaches to addressing these challenges," Crocket acknowledged candidly. "But I think we both recognize the importance of creating stable foundations from which young people can build meaningful futures." Miller nodded. "Despite our political differences, we share concern about young Americans facing extraordinary obstacles to developing their capabilities and contributing to their communities." This acknowledgement, that different political frameworks could still recognize certain shared priorities, created space for dialogue that moved beyond typical partisan positioning without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement. As the formal conversation transitioned to more informal interactions, Miller and Crocket circulated among small groups of teenagers, engaging directly about their specific situations and aspirations. These individual conversations revealed something important about both visitors. Beneath their public political personas lay genuine interest in understanding how young people navigated extraordinary challenges. In one corner, Miller listened attentively as a young man described his difficulty obtaining identification documents necessary for employment, a bureaucratic obstacle that resonated with his concerns about system efficiency regardless of political framework. Nearby, Crocket engaged with a young woman preparing for a GED exam, despite housing instability, a demonstration of perseverance that connected with her focus on expanding educational access. The shelter director, watching these interactions with evident appreciation, commented quietly to a staff member, "What's happening here isn't political conversion or abandoned principles. It's genuine interest in understanding these young people's experiences beyond typical political framings, interest that creates space for recognizing certain shared concerns despite maintained differences." This capacity to engage authentically with young people's challenges without filtering everything through partisan positioning allowed both visitors to see dimensions of youth homelessness that sometimes disappeared in political debate. Their different perspectives actually created more comprehensive understanding, as each noticed aspects the other might have overlooked through their particular political lens. As the scheduled visit neared conclusion, Miller and Crocket rejoined the full group for final reflections. Rather than offering political platitudes or campaign-style promises, they shared observations that demonstrated how listening had genuinely informed their thinking regardless of maintained political differences. "What I'm taking from our conversation," Miller reflected, "is deeper understanding of how fragmented systems create practical barriers even when resources technically exist. That insight transcends typical budget debates to focus on implementation challenges that affect your immediate well-being." Crocket nodded. "And I'm struck by how your experiences highlight both systemic obstacles and individual resilience. Policy frameworks sometimes overlook the remarkable strength you demonstrate navigating extraordinary challenges while maintaining educational aspirations." As they prepared to depart, 18-year-old Tasha, who had remained quiet throughout most of the conversation, raised her hand to speak. "Most people see us through political filters that miss who we actually are," she observed with remarkable clarity. "Today felt different because you both seemed interested in our actual experiences, rather than just finding examples that fit your political narratives. That kind of listening matters more than which policies you support." Her words captured something essential about what had transpired during this unusual visit. Without abandoning their distinct perspectives, both Miller and Crocket had created space for genuine engagement with young people's lived experiences, engagement that recognized certain shared concerns despite maintained political differences. As Miller and Crocket prepared to leave the shelter, something unexpected happened. Darnell, the 16-year-old who had shared his educational challenges, approached with a question that transcended typical political framings. "Could I show you both something before you go?" he asked, gesturing toward a small table in the corner where he had arranged several school assignments. "These are projects I've been trying to complete despite everything, and I'd appreciate your perspectives." What followed demonstrated something increasingly rare in American public life: the capacity to engage young people's aspirations through lenses that transcended partisan positioning without requiring abandoned principles. Miller noticed technical elements in Darnell's science project that connected with his emphasis on practical skills leading to economic opportunity. Crocket identified themes in his history essay that reflected her focus on expanding educational access across different communities. Their different perspectives actually enriched the feedback Darnell received, creating more comprehensive engagement with his work than either visitor might have provided alone. This wasn't about political conversion or artificial agreement. It was about bringing distinct frameworks to bear on a young person's educational aspirations in ways that transcended typical partisan positioning. As they reviewed his work together, shelter staff noticed something remarkable happening throughout the community room. Other teenagers began sharing their own projects and aspirations, finding receptive interest from visitors approaching their goals through different but equally attentive perspectives. Marcus showed Miller architectural designs he had sketched for affordable housing units, receiving feedback that connected technical elements to potential career pathways. Sophia shared her interest in healthcare administration with Crocket, finding encouragement that linked educational opportunities to addressing community needs. Throughout these interactions, both visitors maintained their distinct perspectives while finding unexpected alignment around supporting these young people's immediate aspirations. "What's happening here isn't political agreement," observed shelter counselor James Wilson quietly. "It's recognition that these young people's potential transcends partisan framings. Recognition that creates space for supporting their aspirations through different but complementary perspectives." This capacity, to engage young people's goals without filtering everything through political positioning, allowed both visitors to see dimensions of youth development that sometimes disappeared in partisan debate. Their different frameworks actually created more comprehensive support, as each offered insights the other might have missed through their particular political lens. As these interactions continued, Shelter Director Maria Hernandez noticed something else significant. The teenagers were responding not to political alignment, but to authentic engagement with their circumstances and aspirations. Young people who typically encountered adults viewing them through preconceived filters found visitors genuinely interested in their experiences and potential, regardless of political framework. "Most adults either see us as victims who need saving or problems that need fixing," Tasha commented to the director as they observed these interactions. "Today feels different because they seem interested in who we actually are beyond those simplistic categories." This observation captured something essential about what was unfolding. Without abandoning their distinct perspectives, both Miller and Crocket had created space for engagement that recognized these teenagers' agency and potential beyond typical political framings. Recognition that resonated regardless of the different policy approaches each visitor might support. When the time finally came to conclude the visit, many teenagers gathered by the entrance to say goodbye. What happened next surprised everyone. Marcus, who had initially been most skeptical about the visitors' intentions, asked if they would be willing to return for future conversations, perhaps bringing contacts who might provide internship opportunities regardless of political background. "We need practical pathways, not political debates," he explained with remarkable clarity. "You both seem to understand that, even though you approach these issues differently." Miller and Crocket exchanged glances that acknowledged something important about their unusual collaboration. Despite maintaining their distinct political perspectives, they had found unexpected alignment around supporting these young people's immediate aspirations, alignment that created space for practical cooperation without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement. "We'll work on arranging that," Miller responded, taking out his phone to exchange contact information with the shelter director. "There are people across the political spectrum who recognize the importance of creating opportunity pathways for young Americans facing extraordinary challenges." Crocket nodded. "We approach these issues through different frameworks, but we both understand that your potential transcends partisan positioning. Finding ways to support your aspirations serves both individual and societal interests, regardless of political perspective." As they departed together, both visitors recognized something significant about what had transpired during this unusual visit. Without abandoning their distinct political perspectives, they had engaged these teenagers' experiences and aspirations through lenses that transcended typical partisan positioning, creating space for recognizing certain shared priorities despite maintained differences. "What struck me most," Miller commented as they walked to their separate vehicles, "was how their practical challenges often get lost in abstract policy debates that miss immediate implementation obstacles affecting their daily lives." Crocket nodded. "And how their remarkable resilience sometimes disappears beneath statistics that fail to capture the individual determination they demonstrate navigating extraordinary circumstances." This shared recognition that political framing sometimes obscured dimensions of youth homelessness that transcended partisan positioning had created space for engagement that acknowledged certain common concerns without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement. As news of their visit began circulating through Washington networks, many expressed surprise at this unexpected collaboration between political figures typically positioned as opposites. Some assumed it represented strategic positioning or campaign calculation rather than genuine engagement with young people facing extraordinary challenges. What these cynical interpretations missed was something important about both visitors. Beneath their public political personas lay authentic interest in understanding how young Americans navigated obstacles to developing their capabilities and contributing to their communities. This interest created space for engagement that transcended typical partisan framings without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement. Within days, something remarkable began happening that defied these cynical expectations. Rather than leveraging the visit for political messaging, both Miller and Crocket focused on practical follow-through that reflected genuine commitment to the young people they had met. Their different networks actually created complementary pathways for addressing specific needs identified during their conversations at the shelter. Miller connected shelter staff with private sector contacts who could provide internship opportunities focused on technical skills leading to economic independence. Crocket facilitated meetings with education officials to discuss accommodations for students experiencing housing instability. These different but complementary approaches reflected their distinct perspectives while creating practical benefits that transcended typical partisan positioning. What makes their engagement valuable isn't political agreement, observed Shelter Director Hernandez during a staff meeting. It's recognition that these young people's potential transcends partisan framings, recognition that creates space for supporting their aspirations through different but complementary approaches. This capacity to maintain distinct political perspectives while finding practical cooperation around supporting youth development offered something increasingly rare in contemporary politics: engagement that acknowledged genuine differences while creating space for certain shared priorities that transcended partisan positioning. The impact of Miller and Crockett's unusual collaboration extended far beyond their initial visit to New Horizons Youth Shelter. Within weeks, something began emerging that defied typical political patterns: practical initiatives supporting youth facing housing instability that incorporated insights from different perspectives without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement. The most immediate effect appeared through an unexpected partnership between America First Legal and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, organizations typically positioned at opposite ends of the political spectrum. Despite maintaining their distinct frameworks, both established internship programs specifically designed for young people experiencing housing instability, programs that emphasize different aspects of professional development while creating complementary opportunity pathways. These internships reflect different philosophical approaches, acknowledged CBC Foundation Director Robert Johnson. Our program emphasizes structural supports and collective advancement, while ALF's focuses on individual initiative and skill development. But both create practical opportunities for young Americans facing extraordinary challenges, opportunities that transcend typical partisan framings. Miller nodded during the joint announcement. We approach these issues through different frameworks, but we both recognize that young Americans facing housing instability need practical pathways to developing their capabilities and contributing to their communities. That recognition creates space for certain practical cooperation without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement. This unexpected partnership inspired similar initiatives across Washington, where organizations typically defined by partisan positioning found space for practical collaboration around supporting youth development. These weren't about political conversion or compromised principles. They reflected recognition that certain priorities transcended partisan framings without requiring abandoned core perspectives. 3 months after their initial visit, Miller and Crocket returned to New Horizons Youth Shelter, not for cameras or public recognition, but to continue learning from young people navigating extraordinary challenges. Their ongoing engagement reflected something increasingly rare in contemporary politics: commitment to understanding lived experiences that transcended typical partisan positioning without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement. What makes your continued involvement meaningful, Darnell told them during this follow-up visit, is that neither of you seems interested in making us fit your political narratives. You recognize our challenges and aspirations beyond those simplistic framings. This observation captured something essential about what had developed through their unusual collaboration. Without abandoning their distinct perspectives, both Miller and Crocket had created space for engagement with young people's experiences beyond typical political positioning, engagement that recognized certain shared priorities despite maintained differences. 6 months after their initial visit, The impact of their collaboration manifested in unexpected ways that transcended Washington's typical political boundaries. Educational institutions across the political spectrum developed programs specifically designed for students experiencing housing instability, programs that reflected different philosophical frameworks while creating complementary supports for young people facing extraordinary challenges. Conservative Liberty University established Pathways to Independence, an initiative providing technical training and entrepreneurship development for students navigating housing insecurity. Progressive Howard University created Community Foundation Scholarships, focused on comprehensive supports for similar students. These different approaches reflected distinct educational philosophies while addressing complementary dimensions of the challenges young people faced. What makes these initiatives valuable isn't political alignment, observed education specialist Maria Garcia. It's recognition that supporting young Americans facing housing instability serves both individual and societal interests, regardless of political framework. That recognition creates space for complementary approaches that transcend typical partisan positioning. Perhaps most significantly, Miller and Crockett's collaboration inspired similar engagement across the country, where political figures typically defined by partisan opposition found space for practical cooperation around supporting youth development. These partnerships weren't about abandoned principles or artificial agreement. They reflected recognition that certain priorities transcended partisan framings without requiring compromised core perspectives. 1 year after their unexpected visit to New Horizons Youth Shelter, Miller and Crocket found themselves invited to address a national conference on youth development beyond partisan frameworks. Their joint presentation emphasized how different political perspectives could create complementary approaches to supporting young Americans facing extraordinary challenges, approaches that maintain distinct frameworks while recognizing certain shared priorities. We continue to represent alternative visions for governance that democracy requires for meaningful choice, Miller acknowledged during their presentation. What we've discovered through our engagement with young Americans facing housing instability isn't political agreement but recognition that certain priorities transcend partisan positioning without requiring abandoned principles. Crocket nodded. Our different perspectives actually create more comprehensive understanding of the challenges these young people face, as each framework identifies dimensions the other might miss. That complementary insight serves both individual and societal interests regardless of which specific policies one supports. Their presentation inspired initiatives aimed at fostering similar engagement across the country, where organizations typically defined by political opposition found space for practical collaboration around supporting youth development. These partnerships weren't about political conversion or compromised principles. They reflected recognition that certain priorities transcended partisan framings without requiring abandoned core perspectives. 18 months after their initial shelter visit, the most profound impact of Miller and Crockett's collaboration emerged through the young people they had met at New Horizons. Many had found pathways to stability through opportunities created by initiatives their unusual partnership had inspired. Opportunities that reflected different political frameworks while addressing complementary dimensions of the challenges they faced. Darnell had secured a scholarship through Liberty University's program, developing technical skills that created economic independence while maintaining connection with his community. Sophia had found support through Howard University's initiative, accessing educational opportunities while developing leadership capabilities focused on addressing systemic challenges. Marcus had secured an internship with a construction firm through connections Miller had facilitated, while Tasha had found placement with a community development organization through Crockett's network. These different pathways reflected distinct political frameworks while creating complementary opportunities that served both individual and societal interests. Without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement, Miller and Crockett's collaboration had demonstrated how different perspectives could create more comprehensive approaches to supporting youth development, approaches that transcended typical partisan positioning while maintaining distinct core values. 2 years after their unexpected collaboration began, Miller and Crocket found themselves interviewed for a PBS documentary on finding common ground. When asked what they had learned from their unusual partnership despite maintained political differences, both offered reflections that captured something essential about engaging beyond partisan positioning without requiring abandoned principles. "What I've learned," Miller reflected, "isn't that policy differences don't matter. They reflect genuine alternative visions for governance that democracy requires. What I've discovered is that beneath those differences lies recognition that young Americans facing extraordinary challenges need practical pathways to developing their capabilities and contributing to their communities. Recognition that creates space for certain shared priorities without requiring abandoned principles." Crocket nodded. "And that our different perspectives actually create more comprehensive understanding of the challenges these young people face, as each framework identifies dimensions the other might miss. That complementary insight serves both individual and societal interests, regardless of which specific policies one supports." Their unusual collaboration had never pretended that political differences don't matter. It had demonstrated something more important, that those differences could create complementary approaches to supporting youth development when engaged through recognition of certain shared priorities that transcended partisan positioning without requiring abandoned principles or artificial agreement. As the documentary concluded, both reflected on what gave them hope for American civic life, despite deepening political division. "What gives me hope," Miller observed, "is seeing that beneath our genuine political differences lies capacity for recognizing certain shared priorities that transcend partisan positioning without requiring abandoned principles. That capacity creates space for practical collaboration around supporting young Americans facing extraordinary challenges, collaboration that maintains distinct frameworks while acknowledging complementary insights each perspective brings." Crocket added, "And recognizing that our different approaches actually create more comprehensive understanding of complex challenges, as each framework identifies dimensions others might miss. That complementary insight serves both individual and societal interests, regardless of which specific policies one supports." Their unlikely partnership had demonstrated something increasingly rare in contemporary politics: capacity to maintain distinct perspectives while finding practical cooperation around certain priorities that transcended partisan positioning. This wasn't about abandoned principles or artificial agreement. It was about recognizing that different political frameworks could create complementary approaches to supporting youth development without requiring compromised core values. This is the kind of civic engagement America needs now more than ever. If you found this story of engagement beyond partisan positioning inspiring, please like and subscribe for more content that highlights capacity for practical collaboration without requiring abandoned principles. Together, we can develop approaches to supporting young Americans that transcend political division while maintaining the principled differences democracy requires.